November 28th, 1852. Across Louisiana, families gathered around tables, raising glasses of wine in celebration of the harvest season. Roast turkey dripping with butter, candied yams glazed with honey, and steaming pumpkin pies filled the air with warmth. Fiddles played, children laughed, prayers echoed in unison. It was Thanksgiving, alive with joy. But at Willow Creek Plantation, the holiday carried a different scent. The heavy, choking stench of bubbling fat, thick smoke curling through the kitchen like a living thing. And standing in the middle of that haze was Martha Greene, the old cook who had spent half her life in this house. Her hands stirred the great cauldron with steady rhythm, but her eyes were not fixed on the boiling lard. They drifted quietly through the doorway toward the brightly lit main house, where Tobias Haraway, the arrogant master, lifted his glass of whiskey. At his side sat his three sons, Edward, Marcus, and Samuel, laughing thunderously as though the world itself had been made to serve them. They waited there, expecting a feast, unaware that the same kitchen which had fed them all their lives was, on this night, about to become their gallows. Its flames the hangman, its grease the rope. Later, the newspapers would call it the Willow Creek Thanksgiving Massacre. They described Martha as mad, a wild beast unleashed. But to those who remembered the night Tobias sold a 7-year-old girl, Martha's daughter, to pay his debts, or who had heard the Haraways laughing while a slave was beaten to death, this was not madness. It was a debt collected, written in the only recipe the old cook had left. Outsiders saw Martha as nothing more than a stooped shadow in the kitchen, silent, meek, her life reduced to ladles and wooden spoons. But in truth, for 30 years she had been gathering, not spices, but memories, and an ember of rage that refused to die. And on November 28th, 1852, that boiling pot was no longer meant for turkey. It was meant for the men who believed themselves untouchable in their laughter. They say, "Where there is a hearth, there is peace." But for Martha Greene, the fire no longer meant safety. It was the beginning of judgment. Within hours, Edward, Marcus, Samuel, and Tobias Haraway would writhe on the kitchen floor, their flesh blistered, the grand house silent as a tomb. And in the kitchen, the fire would still roar, not just a flame for cooking, but a whip of justice, the only justice Martha had ever been granted. This is not the story of a crazed rebel. It is the story of a mother who lost her child, not senseless chaos, but a final verdict, written not in ink, but in boiling grease and screams. So if you are watching this with a golden turkey on your plate, take one firm bite. For Martha Greene's story reminds us, some meals are not meant to be eaten, but remembered. A Thanksgiving feast seasoned with vengeance. Night of November 28th, 1852. Thanksgiving fires flickered all across Louisiana, but within the grounds of Willow Creek Plantation, two parallel worlds revealed themselves, like two crooked paintings hanging on the same wall. In the parlor, the chandelier glowed golden, its light scattering across the walls until everything seemed gilded. On the long white draped table, turkey stuffed with lemon, venison stewed in wine, cakes dusted with sugar, all arranged as though this feast had been prepared for royalty itself. Crystal glasses clinked, whiskey flowed like a river, cigar smoke curled upward, mixing with peals of laughter. Edward, Marcus, and Samuel, the three sons of Tobias, raised their glasses high, boasting of new lands seized, of profits freshly pocketed. They laughed, shouted, called their father the builder of an empire. Tobias nodded along, his belly swollen with drink, his eyes gleaming with pride, or perhaps just with drunken haze. To an outsider, it would have looked like the perfect family portrait of a prosperous South, a Thanksgiving paradise fit to be printed in history books. But what kind of paradise is built on the blood and sweat of others? Just down the hallway, paradise turned instantly into hell. In the kitchen, waves of heat rolled from the fires, thick with the stench of lard boiling in iron pots until the air was heavy enough to slice with a knife. The slaves moved silently like shadows, eyes down, hands quick, stuffing pies, carrying trays, scrubbing dishes. And at the center stood Martha Greene, the cook, stirring the great copper cauldron. The fat hissed and spat, scalding drops bursting against her arms. Yet she never flinched. Her body cooked, Her mind was elsewhere. Her gaze pierced through the walls, fixed on the bright room beyond, where the men who had once sold her daughter were now raising their glasses to family. Outside, in the slave quarters, the cold wind whistled through gaps in rotten wood. Inside, children huddled under rags that could hardly be called blankets. Adults sat shoulder to shoulder, forcing down watery gruel as though it were their only feast. There was no music here, only coughing fits, the rattle of chains and sighs that came out broken. In the same moment, two worlds lived only steps apart, one drowning in wine, meat, light, and music. The other starved, freezing, swallowed by silence. One laughed so loudly they believed themselves untouchable. The other bowed so deeply they believed themselves invisible. And yet it was the silence that proved most dangerous. For inside silence smoldered memory, burned injustice, and debts unpaid. If someone had written a postcard of Willow Creek that night, the front would show the glowing mansion, a banquet of turkey and wine. But flip it over, and in small letters you'd read, "Thanksgiving reminds us, not everyone has a seat at the table." That night, Martha understood better than anyone. While one side raised a glass of cheers, the other could raise only a ladle of gruel. And that same night, she knew it was time to prepare a different dish, the only dish that could bring those two worlds crashing together. Before the world knew her as Martha Greene, the cook of Willow Creek, there was once a barefoot girl named Essie who chased fireflies with the torn hem of her mother's dress. That was back when the kitchen fires still smelled of warm rice, not of boiling lard. Essie's mother, Hagar, was a woman of few words, but her hands carried secrets. She taught her daughter that in a kitchen, some ingredients never appeared in any recipe: a pinch of patience, a spoonful of silence, and a fistful of memory. When the stew simmered, Hagar would say, "You don't need to shout, just wait, just watch, then give it what it needs." At first, it was only a cooking lesson. Later, it became the formula for survival: endure, wait, and one day repay every debt. Essie's father, Jonas, worked the cane fields. One morning, he was accused of stealing a jar of molasses. Proof? None. All they needed was an excuse. They tied him to the iron cross behind the smokehouse, the same place they hung slaughtered pigs. For 2 days, they left him there under the sun, blood dripping into the dirt, flies buzzing as his only audience. Essie was 12. She watched through the crack of the kitchen door, saw her father's legs trembling, saw his back spasm at every lash. In the cruelest moment, when he finally drew his last breath, the master's children, including young Samuel Haraway, pelted his corpse with stones, laughing as if it were sport. Essie did not cry. She did not scream. She stood still, storing every detail. From then on, every bubbling pot echoed like her father's blood, hissing into the earth. By 15, Essie had become the woman of the kitchen. They praised her, born with a cook's hands, meaning her food was rich, flavorful, unforgettable. But no one knew that as she sliced meat, she was also slicing grief into paper-thin layers, hiding her wounds where no one could see them bleed. She learned which leaves could soothe pain, which seeds could draw tears, which fire could turn a meal into a memory no one would forget. But her greatest skill was not seasoning, it was pretending. She mastered the art of bowing at the right time, smiling when insulted, keeping silent when she wanted to scream. If there had been an award for leading actress in the role of the invisible, Essie would have won every year. For her entire youth, she lived as a shadow in the kitchen, present only to clean, to cook, to serve, and to disappear when no longer needed. Years passed and Essie became Martha Greene, but the memory of her father crucified on iron never left her. It clung to every drop of sweat that fell into her pots. She understood then, dying in silence was crueler than the whip, and so she swore. Never again would memory be swallowed by silence. The child had learned her first enduring lesson. In the kitchen, not every pot is for food. Some pots cook tears, some pots cook waiting, and some pots one day will cook vengeance. On Thanksgiving night, 1852, as the fat hissed and spat, Martha knew The cauldron before her was no longer filled with grease. It was brimming with the memories of a lifetime stolen. After her father's death, Martha grew up with a hollow inside her that nothing could fill. But fate was not finished with her yet. It had prepared another wound, deeper, sharper, and one that would haunt her until her last breath. In the smoky, sweat-stained kitchen, Martha once found a fragile comfort, her daughter, Clara Greene. Clara was born among the crackle of wood fire and the clatter of ladles against iron pots, raised on crumbs of bread and lullabies whispered in the dark. Clara never knew who her father was, and Martha never told. But in the child's eyes, Martha saw the last fragment of her own humanity, the part that lashes, hunger, and silence had not yet stolen. To Martha, Clara was the only sweet dish in a life otherwise seasoned only with bitterness. The little girl had eyes bright as fireflies and tiny hands that loved to play with flour, tracing shapes across the wooden table. Each time she laughed, Martha would murmur, "Even if the whole world is a prison, as long as I have you, I am still free." But that fragile freedom was torn away when Clara was only 7. One June morning, Tobias Haraway, the master of Willow Creek, needed to settle a gambling debt, and the easiest asset to liquidate was a child. He summoned Samuel, his youngest son, to the kitchen. With a smirk, Samuel delivered the news. "Clara is lucky. We're sending her north to learn a trade. She'll have a brighter future. Your mother should thank us." Martha froze, still clutching a wooden spoon. She wanted to scream, to throw herself forward, but her legs felt shackled. She knew resistance meant whips, blood, and Clara would vanish even faster. That afternoon, a carriage stopped at the door. Clara was lifted inside, her wide eyes blinking in confusion, her tiny hand waving back toward her mother. Martha stood in the kitchen doorway's shadow, her heart torn to shreds. Her rough hands lifted, but could not reach. She bit her lip until it bled, refusing to cry in front of them. Only after the carriage disappeared beyond the trees did Martha stagger into the empty fields, where she screamed until her throat broke. Screams so raw, even the frogs in the swamp went silent. That night she cooked a pot of soup red as blood. No one noticed, but Martha knew. From that day on, her food would never again taste of sweetness. After Clara was gone, Martha became a shadow. She cooked, she cleaned, she stayed silent, but her eyes no longer held any flame except the fire of grief. Whenever Samuel laughed, she remembered his smirk when he told her Clara was sent away to study. Whenever Edward boasted of their proud family, she saw Clara huddled in the carriage, clutching her rag doll. Whenever Marcus cursed in the kitchen, she heard the echo of her own screams the night her child was taken. One evening, standing alone before the cauldron of boiling grease, Martha whispered, "They took my child, but they will pay, not in money, not with lashes, but with this very fire." It was not a curse nor a prayer. It was a vow, the vow of a mother robbed of her child, of a heart that had nothing left to lose. If anyone asked, what is the strongest weapon a cook can wield? Most would say a sharp knife or an iron ladle. But for Martha, the strongest weapon was memory. Memory of the child stolen from her. And she carried that memory for 15 long years, until Thanksgiving night, 1852, when the cauldron of boiling fat became the final verdict. A judgment from which no Haraway would escape. If Martha Greene was the smoldering fire, then the Haraway family was the heap of rotting refuse. Foul, puffing smoke, toxic the longer it burned. On Thanksgiving night, 1852, 4 men sat in the great house, imagining themselves perched at the pinnacle of power, never suspecting they were about to become the main course of destiny's feast. Tobias Haraway, the kernel of lies. Tobias cloaked himself in the airs of experience, styling himself the Colonel. Though he had never set foot on a battlefield, he sat at the center of the glittering room, his belly straining against his vest, whiskey glass in hand as though it were the scepter of life and death. Every word from his lips dripped hypocrisy. "I demand discipline. Laborers should be grateful." Yet everyone at Willow Creek knew Tobias lived only on the sweat and blood of others. Once, when a slave collapsed from exhaustion, Tobias offered no water, called no doctor. He simply murmured, "Laziness dies. Simple as that. If Tobias was a colonel, he was colonel only of deceit, a gambler neck-deep in debts, a man willing to sell a 7-year-old child to cover a petty loss. Edward Haraway, the inheritance of greed. Edward, the eldest son, entered his 40s with a thick beard and a swollen beer belly, yet carried himself as the heir to the Willow Creek Empire. His lust was for money. Every story he told ended in numbers. Talk of the sugar cane harvest became profits. Talk of laborers turned into investment value. To Edward, human beings were nothing more than breathing stacks of currency. At feasts, he often leaned back in his chair, roaring with laughter so harsh it sounded like clashing metal. Martha once overheard him say to Samuel, "Negroes are like oxen. Feed them just enough to plow, and that's mercy." If arrogance could be melted down, Edward would have been the first ingot to throw into the furnace. Marcus Haraway, the tongue of poison. Marcus, at 35, was less obsessed with wealth, but far worse in cruelty of speech. He delighted in mockery, in shrinking others with words. During dinners, he crossed his legs, whistled, then delivered cutting remarks that sent the room into laughter, leaving the target bowed and humiliated. Once, as Martha carried a tray of cornbread, Marcus flicked his wrist so it crashed to the floor. He doubled over, laughing. "Look at that! Even cornbread knows how to kneel." It was not wit. It was a blade dipped in venom. Marcus lived by grinding salt into wounds, finding amusement in others' humiliation. Samuel Haraway, the smile that killed. If Edward embodied greed in Marcus' cruelty of tongue, then Samuel, the youngest at 28, was the incarnation of heartless brutality dressed in a smile. He smiled everywhere, always. White, polished, charming at first glance, but beneath it lay an ice-cold ruthlessness that froze anyone who looked too long. It was Samuel who carried the news that Clara, Martha's daughter, had been sold away. He tilted his head, smirking as he spoke. "The girl is lucky. She's being sent north to learn a trade. Her mother should be grateful." The way he uttered lucky etched itself into Martha's soul. To her, Samuel was not merely cruel. He was the living memory of her greatest loss, the Haraway for Tobias, Edward, Marcus, Samuel. 4 names, 4 shades of evil, bound by a single belief that they were untouchable. They drank, they feasted, they spun tales of conquest as if they were gods on Olympus. They believed laughter and power would protect them forever. But on that Thanksgiving night of 1852, the very things they scorned most, the kitchen, the fire, the boiling grease, and the silent woman named Martha Greene, would become the hammer that fell, sealing the final verdict against the Haraway family. Some uprisings erupt with drums, shouts, the clash of steel on steel. But Martha Greene's revolt began with silence, a silence thick as smoke, heavy as iron, stretched across decades, until Thanksgiving night, 1852. In 30 years behind the stove, Martha had not only learned how to season food, she had learned how to season memory. She remembered every small habit of the Haraway clan. Tobias always downed 3 whiskeys before sitting to dinner, and by the 4th his hand began to tremble. Edward often slipped away from the feast to fuss over ledgers, believing his empire lived on ink and paper. Marcus crept into the kitchen to mock her, then strutted back to the dining room with tales of the old cook half in the grave. Samuel prowled the halls, grinning, touching everything as though the house were his personal stage. Martha kept track of it all, not with pen and paper, but with scars on her skin, with nights of swallowed sobs, with the ghost of Clara etched into memory. The kitchen, meant to be her cage, became her battleground. The cleaver became her weapon, the iron ladle, a hammer, the cauldron of lard, a molten pit of judgment. By day, Martha stirred soups, baked pies, spiced roasts. By night, she trained, lifting heavy pots, pivoting quickly in tight corners, stepping lightly so the floorboards did not creak. She moved like a fighter. Only her weapons were wooden spoons and fire. Some had seen her stand for hours staring at the staircase. They thought her mind was slipping. In truth, she was memorizing which steps groaned, which held firm, so that when the moment came, she would move like a ghost. Others waited for golden brown turkey, but in the kitchen Martha was feeding another beast, the great vat of boiling lard. She knew that at 375 degrees, fat didn't just crisp skin, it stripped lies to the bone. Each time hot oil hissed, she remembered Samuel's smirk, his false words that Clara had been sent north to study. Each bubbling surge was a bell toll. The hour has come. They will taste justice. The genius of her plan wasn't only in the weapon, but in the Haraway's contempt. Tobias and his son saw Martha as a shadow, old, slow, harmless. That disdain was her perfect armor. If there had been an Oscar for Best Supporting Role Invisible Servant, Martha would have won every year. They never realized the stooped figure in the kitchen was rewriting the script of their final act. On the night of November 27th, the eve of Thanksgiving, Martha sat alone by the hearth. In her hand was not a wooden spoon, but the small knife her mother had left her. She pressed its blade to her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Tomorrow I will not cook a feast. I will cook a sentence." When she set the knife down and fed more wood to the flames, the fire leapt high, glinting in eyes that had long since forgotten how to cry. Thanksgiving night, November 28th, 1852. The clock struck 12, each toll echoing like the opening drums of a bloody play. In the parlor, laughter still roared. Edward raised his glass of whiskey, triumphant. "Another year of success for the House of Haraway," the others bellowed with drunken pride, never noticing that the kitchen behind them burned like the open jaws of a beast. Edward was the first to wander in. He claimed he wanted to check the turkey, but in truth it was only another chance to lord his power over Martha. He staggered in, reeking of liquor, tapping his glass with smug rhythm. "Martha, still not finished. A turkey late is a turkey wasted. The guests might as well eat with their eyes." He chuckled, his voice soaked with contempt. Martha said nothing, her eyes fixed on the cauldron of grease, bubbling, roaring like a volcano. Her ladle stirred slowly, as if following a hidden rhythm. Edward leaned closer, hand reaching for the lid of the vat. In that instant, Martha spun, faster, harder than he could have imagined. The iron ladle cracked across his wrist. "Ah!" Edward shrieked, whiskey glass shattering at his feet. Before he could comprehend, Martha gripped her thick gloves and heaved. The cauldron tipped, unleashing a wave of boiling fat that crashed onto his body. The sound was inhuman, the hiss of flesh meeting fire, like a fish thrown into a burning pan. Edward's scream shattered into jagged pieces, echoing down the corridor. He writhed, blazing red, before collapsing to the tiles, his eyes bulging, skin blistering away. If justice ever fit him, it was this, cooked alive in the very grease he had once forced others to labor for. His screams drew Marcus storming down the stairs. No weapon but a fireplace poker, his face flushed with drink and fear. "Martha, what devilry is this?" he roared. The kitchen was hell itself, smoke thick, grease and blood slicking the floor, Edward's body convulsing on the ground. Before Marcus could retreat, Martha snatched up the meat cleaver. Steel flashed in the haze. She charged without a scream, without a curse, only precision. Marcus swung wildly, the poker clanging, but his drunk hand wavered. Martha darted aside, her blade slicing his leg. He buckled, howling. "Witch, they'll hang you for this!" he spat, eyes wild. Martha leaned close, breath laced with hot fat, her voice iron. "No, I'm only cooking what you've sown." Then, with the weight of 30 years, she shoved him back toward the fire. His last swing was pitiful. Martha seized the great ladle, scooped, and flung what remained of the boiling grease straight into his face. Marcus screamed, a scream that cracked, faltered, and dissolved into choking sobs. He fell beside his brother, two Haraway sons shriveled, blistered, consumed like scraps thrown to the fire. The kitchen fell eerily still. Only the popping of fat remained, like a morbid applause for the carnage just staged. Martha stood tall, her dress spattered with oil and blood, her eyes gleaming through the smoke. She did not laugh. She did not cry. She simply inhaled, deep and steady, as if she had just finished preparing the most important dish of her life. Above, the parlor had gone silent. Tobias and Samuel had heard. They would come. But Martha felt no fear. Because tonight, the kitchen was no longer a place of cooking, it was a court of fire, and Martha Greene was the sole judge. The agonized screams of Edward and Marcus still echoed through the hallway when Samuel Haraway appeared in the kitchen doorway. Unlike his brothers, he did not rush in. He strolled, glass of whiskey in hand, lips curled in that half-smile Martha had hated for years, the smile that turned every cruelty into mockery. The firelight flickered across his face, casting a long, trembling shadow on the tiles, as unsteady as his false charm. He lifted the glass, swirled it lazily, and smirked. "Well, Martha, what's all this? Edward and Marcus look like roasts left too long in the oven. You really do have a talent." He sipped, eyes sweeping over the mangled bodies without a hint of shame. If Edward had been arrogance and Marcus venom of the tongue, then Samuel was cruelty behind a smile, always twisting pain into entertainment. Martha stood, gripping the cleaver, her silence heavier than any shout. She didn't need words, her stillness alone chilled the room, though the fire roared. Samuel set his glass on the table and strolled forward, shoes squelching in spilled grease. He crouched by Edward's body, whistled softly, then looked up with that razor grin. "Do you remember Clara? Bright eyes, always laughing. She was lucky, you know. Sent north to learn a trade. Perhaps she's a fine lady now." The name cracked Martha's stillness. Clara's small hand waving from the carriage, her rag doll clutched to her chest, flooded back like a blade through her heart. Her eyes flared. She stepped forward, voice hoarse but sharp as a bell. "You call that luck?" Samuel chuckled, tilting his head, grin widening. "For a girl. Like her, leaving this kitchen was luck enough, wasn't it?" The words had barely left his mouth when Martha struck. She lunged, fire exploding from ashes, cleaver slicing through his sleeve and drawing a deep red gash along his arm. For a heartbeat, the grin faltered. Shock flickered in his eyes before he snarled, snatching a fireplace rod. "Fine then, old woman. You want to play? I'll show you what my real smile looks like." He swung. Martha ducked, seizing a long-handled iron ladle from the wall. With a sharp twist, she slammed it into his jaw. Crack! Teeth shattered. A spray of blood and enamel clattered onto the tiles, mixing with pools of oil. Samuel's scream tore from his throat. His grin splintered into mangled flesh. Martha didn't hesitate. She turned, gripped the cauldron, and heaved. A final wave of boiling fat surged forward, crashing over his chest, shoulders, face. The sound was monstrous, skin blistering, flesh searing, the hiss of justice delivered in fire. Samuel writhed, shrieks echoing through the mansion, the last song of a cruel soul. He collapsed, clawing the air as if to snatch a final chance. But there was nothing left to grasp. His smile, his weapon, dissolved with his burning skin. The kitchen fell silent. Martha stood trembling, sweat and smoke streaking her brow, the iron still hot in her hands. Before her, Samuel lay twisted and blackened, lips once curved in mockery, now sealed in charred ruin. Martha whispered, not for him, but for the child ripped away so long ago. "Clara, he will never laugh at your mother's pain again." The firelight threw her shadow high across the wall, tall, unyielding, no longer a weary cook, but the silhouette of a judge delivering sentence. If Samuel had ever written a book on the art of smiling, this kitchen wrote his final chapter instead. The smile of evil cannot survive once the oil has boiled hot enough for justice. The screams of Edward, Marcus, and Samuel had not yet faded when Tobias Haraway staggered down the stairs. His once-pressed vest was crumpled, his tie crooked, his breath thick with whiskey. But in his trembling hand he still clutched a pistol, like a frail shield against the inferno waiting for him. He stopped at the kitchen threshold, his bloodshot eyes widening. Before him lay a nightmare. Edward and Marcus twisted, their skin blistered and peeling. Samuel, the youngest and most beloved, reduced to a grotesque husk, the stench of burnt flesh mingling with the greasy smoke. Tobias's mouth fell open, but no words came. He had grown accustomed to the screams of slaves, but to hear those same screams torn from his own blood, it pierced him deeper than any blade. In the center of the kitchen stood Martha Greene, gripping the meat cleaver, her hair plastered with sweat and smoke. She did not bow. She did not flinch. Her gaze met his, steady as iron. For a long, awful moment, the only sound was the steady hiss of grease bubbling in the cauldron. "Martha!" Tobias rasped, voice cracking. You killed them!" Martha did not deny it. She stepped forward once, her voice calm, almost like reciting a recipe. "No, you killed them long ago. I only set the table." Tobias raised the pistol, his hands shaking. The first shot rang out, slamming into the wooden wall, shattering a jar of salt that sprayed white like a sudden blizzard. Martha didn't flinch. She walked forward slowly, each step carrying the ghost of Clara beside her. "Stay back! Stay back!" Tobias shouted, but his voice cracked into something pitiful. There was no trace of the colonel's authority left. The second shot went wide. The pistol slipped from his sweat-soaked palm. Martha bent down, picked up the iron ladle slick with grease, and placed it gently on the table, her eyes never leaving him. Tobias stumbled backward until his spine struck the stove. The firelight cast his shadow grotesque and quivering, like a dying beast. "You're nothing but a cook, a worthless kitchen wench!" he shrieked, desperate. Martha tilted her head, lips curling into a faint, bitter smile, not of triumph, but of grim recognition. After decades, Tobias had finally spoken the truth. He had never seen her as human. She stepped closer to the cauldron, its grease still boiling, eyes glinting with reflected fire. "Yes, just a cook, but tonight, this kitchen doesn't cook food. Tonight, it cooks truth." Tobias's hands trembled. He collapsed, knees buckling, the pistol clattering to the tiles. In that moment, the man who once paraded as colonel was stripped to nothing but primal fear, the terror of being consumed by the very flames he had forced others to stoke. Martha did not need to tip the cauldron. Tobias was already undone. He died slumped against the stove, eyes wide, mouth agape in a silent scream, as though the horror of what he saw had burned him from the inside out. They found him at dawn, the fire long dimmed. He sat rigid beside the stove, fingers clawing the chair, his face frozen purple from whiskey and despair. If Tobias ever fancied himself a colonel, history gave him a different rank, the colonel of collapse. His death was not glorious on a battlefield, but in a kitchen drowned in grease where he once believed himself master. That kitchen, that night, taught him the final lesson. When the flames grow hot enough, even those who think themselves immortal will be boiled alive in their own arrogance. At the first pale breath of dawn behind the trees, the great house of Willow Creek stood silent as a tomb. No laughter, no crystal glasses clinking. Only the thick stench of burnt grease, scorched wood, and seared flesh clung to the air. On the kitchen floor, 4 shadows had fallen. Tobias and his 3 sons, the men who once believed themselves immortal, were nothing now but twisted remnants. Thanksgiving had become their collective altar. Martha Greene stood at the threshold, drawing one long breath. Her calloused hands still trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of memory finally set down. She did not turn back, did not spare them a last glance. It was finished. From beneath the floorboards, she retrieved a small bundle, a few coins, a scrap of cloth embroidered with the letter C that Clara once left behind, and the small knife of her mother, Hagar. That was all Martha carried, light enough that to a stranger she might have seemed only a woman off to market. She opened the door. The hinges groaned like the house's final sigh. Cool mist curled around her bare ankles, and for the first time in decades, Martha felt herself step out of the cage called Willow Creek. She did not rush. She knew the hounds would be loosed, that overseers would soon scour the brush. But in the heavy dew-soaked dark, she walked calmly into the swamps, the one place white men feared to tread. The cypress roots twisted like gnarled arms. Cold water rose to her knees. But to Martha, it was an embrace. She had come here before, to cry alone, to scream Clara's name into the trees. Tonight, the swamp was no longer her confessional. Tonight, it was her sanctuary. By the next day, she found the shack deep in the thickets, the home of old Salome, the healer whispered of as the witch mother of the marsh. 3 knocks, and the door creaked open. Salome looked her over, hair matted with grease, eyes red with smoke, dress stained with ash and blood. She nodded as if she had been waiting for this moment all her life. "You've done it," Salome murmured. "Yes." "They're gone," Martha answered, her voice thin as wind over ash. The old woman led her inside and hung a pouch of herbs, mint, bay leaf, sage, around her neck. Their fragrance covered the stench of blood, sealing Martha not as a slave cook anymore, but as a survivor carrying the flame of judgment. Within days, the news spread. The Haraways slaughtered on Thanksgiving night. Newspapers printed it as the madness of a deranged kitchen servant. But in the cabins and quarters, another version was whispered. Martha wasn't mad. Martha cooked them. She served them the meal they had fed us for years: pain, silence, and fire. Her story traveled fast, beyond Willow Creek, woven into lullabies, muttered by firesides, etched into memory, where history would not write her name. That night in Salome's hut, Martha sat before a small blue flame, whispering Clara's name as though her daughter were there beside her. "Child, I could not bring you home, but I made them remember. That I never forgot. I will never forget." Outside, the wind passed through the swamp, carrying her words. And from that time on, people said, "On Thanksgiving night, if you stand near Willow Creek at midnight, you will hear oil bubbling in the wind and a low, steady voice whispering, 'Silence is enough.'" Willow Creek quickly became a story whispered across Louisiana. Statues were still raised for men with silver stars. Newspapers still praised the colonel. But no one dared speak Martha Greene's name in public. And yet in the dim glow of cabin hearths, her name burned brighter than any monument. Among plantation masters, the tale was repeated like a warning. A kitchen slave went mad, slaughtered her masters, and fled. They told it to justify harsher whips, harsher chains. But in the ears of the enslaved, the tale turned into an anthem. Martha turned the kitchen into a tribunal. She did not wait for justice from the lash holder. She cooked it with her own hands. Whenever a woman was beaten, voices whispered, "Remember Martha." Whenever a child was sold, the murmur rose again. Martha is still with us. Generation after generation, the legend grew. They said that every Thanksgiving, if you sat close to the fire and listened carefully, you could hear grease sizzling, not from supper, but from the past itself. Mothers stirring soup told their daughters, "Don't cook only with salt. Cook with memory, as Martha did." A man about to raise the whip sometimes froze, hearing in the back of his mind, "Martha is watching." Rumors claim Martha never died in the swamps. Some said she fled to Texas, living under another name. Others swore she joined the Maroons, becoming a queen in the shadows. One hunter insisted he once saw a woman walk across the water, ladle in hand like a scepter, before vanishing into mist. The truth was unknowable, but truth wasn't needed. Legend was stronger than records, and memory lasted longer than gravestones. Willow Creek fell into ruin. Weeds consumed the path. Roofs caved in. Yet the kitchen remained. Those who dared step inside swore the air was thick with rancid grease, the floorboards soft as if soaked with something darker, and always the feeling that eyes pressed into their back. No one stayed through the night, and still every late November, someone, no one knew who, left a small bundle of dried herbs at the kitchen door. Bay leaves, peppercorns, rosemary, a silent offering. We remember. Martha Greene's name was never etched in stone. No bronze statue, no official hymn. But she lived in whispers, in fireside retellings, in the bowed heads of those who remembered Clara, the child stolen away. The paper colonels, like Tobias Haraway, have been forgotten, but not Martha, for she taught a people that justice is not always found in courts. Sometimes it waits in the kitchen, in the flame, in the boiling oil, and whenever grease pops in a pan, someone shivers, not from fear, but from the certainty that Martha Greene's fire has never gone out.